The waterfall was laughing at her. That was the only word for it, that white curtain of water pouring 50 feet down black basalt, catching the gray October light and throwing it back in fragments, indifferent to the cold, indifferent to the woman standing at its edge, with a pack on her back and $21 in a leather pouch that felt lighter every time she thought about it. Eliza Holt stood there for a long moment, rain soaking through the collar of her coat, and she laughed back. Not the laugh of someone who has found something funny, the laugh of someone who has decided in the space between one breath and the next that fear is simply another form of information, and she had received enough of it for 1 week. 6 days earlier, she had been standing on a different kind of ground. The porch boards of the Holt farmhouse had always announced visitors before they could announce themselves a particular creak near the third plank, lower grown at the corner post. Eliza heard her own footsteps as if they belonged to someone else, someone walking toward a room she already knew would be changed by the time she reached it. Her father sat in the leather chair by the fireplace, the one worn pale at the armrest from decades of the same posture, the same man settling into the same resignation. Harold Holt was not a cruel man. That was the thing people always said about him, the thing that made the cruelty harder to name. He was a man who had stopped feeling things at a precise moment in time the morning they buried Ruth and had never found reason to start again. He didn't look up when Eliza came in. The fire was going, which meant he had been sitting there long enough to build it up twice, which meant he had been rehearsing whatever came next for most of the morning. The document on the table was folded in thirds, the paper already softened at the creases from handling. Harold's voice, when it came, had the texture of something read aloud rather than spoken, each word placed with the care of a man who has decided that if he controls the language precisely enough, he won't have to control anything else. He read from Ruth Holt's will, the section Eliza had never been shown, the section that bequeathed the 40 acres near Coldwater Falls to her eldest daughter. He did not explain why Ruth had wanted this. He did not explain why he had waited 3 years after her death to produce this document. He set the paper on the table, pressed it flat with 2 fingers, and returned his eyes to the fire. There was nothing behind those eyes that Eliza could use. She had learned this the way children learn all essential truths through repetition, through the quiet accumulation of evidence that a door is locked before you try the handle. She crossed the room, picked up the document, and read it once. The land description was specific: 40 acres in the Sierra Nevada foothills, bounded on the east by Coldwater Creek, on the north by a granite ridge, identified only as the basalt shelf. No structures, no improvements. Current assessed value $40, listed with a notation that the assessor had declined to revise the figure upward on grounds that the terrain made development impractical. She folded the paper back along its existing creases. Through the window of the back bedroom, May was watching. 18 years old, her braids longer than they'd been last spring, her face holding the specific expression of someone who has been told to stay out of something and is staying out of it at great personal cost. Her palm was flat against the glass finger spread, as if she were trying to push through it and had decided the gesture itself was sufficient. Eliza looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to register, not long enough to make it harder than it already was. Stopping was a luxury. Stopping meant you had somewhere to go back to. She walked out into the October wind coming down from the mountains, the kind of wind that carried the smell of pine and cold granite, and the specific reminder that the season had already turned without waiting for anyone's permission. Greer's General Store occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building at the center of Millhaven, the nearest town, which was less a town than an agreement between several dozen people to conduct commerce in the same location. Walter Greer had run the store for 30 years, which meant he had heard most versions of most stories and had developed the particular economy of expression that comes from not having time to be surprised. He was 62, with reading glasses on a cord around his neck and hands that moved with the precision of someone who has spent decades measuring things. He read Eliza's land document twice before he said anything, adjusting his glasses once in the middle. Coldwater Falls. He set the paper on the counter between them. Your aunt on your mother's side looked at that parcel in '81, turned it down. He paused, not for dramatic effect, but because he was still thinking. Man from Sacramento looked at it in '84, turned it down faster. He removed his glasses, cleaned them on his shirt hem. Rock and water. The falls are something to look at, I'll grant you that, but the ground around them doesn't farm. The access road washes out every November and doesn't reopen until April if the winter's mild. Nobody who's tried to make a go of it up there has lasted more than a season. Eliza asked him what her options were. He laid them out without sentiment, which she respected. The eastbound stage left Thursday mornings. The new towns growing along the railroad had real-work hotel kitchens, laundry operations, domestic service with wages and roofs included. $21 was enough to get started somewhere sensible. She could send for anything she needed once she was established. He said all of this looking at her directly because Walter Greer was the kind of man who believed honesty delivered plainly was more respectful than honesty wrapped in softening. Eliza put her money on the counter and told him what she needed. 1 quality felling axe, 1 bow saw, 20 pounds of flour, salt, dried beans, 2 pounds of square nails, good rope 50 feet. He assembled everything in silence, writing figures in his ledger as he went. When he'd added the last column, he counted her coins, slowly arranged them in 2 rows. You'll have almost nothing left. He didn't say it as a warning. He said it as a fact he wanted confirmed. I'm trading almost nothing for something. She held his gaze. The math works in my favor. He counted the coins once more. Then he started filling the pack. Before she reached the door, he said it not loudly, not with any visible intention of stopping her, simply because it was true and she had a right to it. Your mother came in here 2 weeks before she passed, asked me about that land. He straightened a jar on the shelf behind him. I told her the same thing I told you. Eliza stood in the doorway with the pack on her shoulder. She didn't ask the next question because the next question was why, and the answer to why was something she was going to have to walk 40 miles to find out. The route to Coldwater Falls was not on any map Walter Greer had in his store. It existed as a description: follow the main road north to the fork at the Dead Oak, take the left branch until the grade steepens past the Hendricks claim, then continue upstream along the creek bed when the road ends. It was the kind of directions that assumed you would understand when the road was ending, which turned out to mean the moment the wagon rut simply stopped, as if the earth had politely declined to be further inconvenienced. The first day was manageable. The terrain climbed steadily through country that still had the character of working land-fenced pasture, giving way to open meadow oaks, spaced generously, the creek running clear and shallow to her left. The pack was heavy in the particular way of things that are heavy because they are necessary, not because anyone miscalculated. She stopped twice to reset the straps, to breathe the cold air that came in longer and sharper the higher she went, and to eat a small portion of the beans she'd soaked and cooked the night before in Millhaven's one boarding house, which had cost her 30 cents she hadn't planned on spending. By late afternoon, the oaks had thinned to scattered individuals, each one looking more committed to its specific location than the last, as if the trees that remained had simply refused to follow the others into easier ground. The meadows narrowed. The fences were long gone. The creek ran faster here, louder, asserting itself over the sound of wind in a way it hadn't in the valley. Eliza made camp on a flat shelf of granite above the creek, built a fire with wood she'd been collecting since mid-afternoon, ate beans and salt, and slept with her back to the rock face. The second day was something different. The terrain shed whatever remained of its accommodation. The grade became a negotiation, 2 steps forward on solid ground, 1 step sideways around a boulder or a section of exposed root that crossed the path at ankle height. The pack, which had been heavy the day before, became architectural, a thing she had to account for in every calculation of balance. She learned by the 3rd steep section to lean slightly forward and let the weight pull her up rather than fighting it from behind. Small physics, the kind of thing that becomes obvious when refusing to figure it out has consequences. The sound reached her before the falls did. It was not a sound precisely. It was the absence of all other sound, bird calls, Wine movement, the creek's own voice replaced by something that didn't operate on the same frequency as hearing. She felt it first in the soles of her boots, a persistent vibration that traveled up through the bones of her feet and shins and settled somewhere in the center of her chest where it sat like a second heartbeat she hadn't agreed to. She stopped walking, put her hand against a granite outcrop and felt it there too. The rock transmitting something ancient and continuous, something that had been happening since long before the first person walked this way and would continue long after the last one. She came around a bend between two walls of granite, and there it was. 50 feet of white water pouring from the lip of a basalt shelf, hitting the pool below, with a force that sent permanent mist 20 feet in every direction, the air around it so saturated that it caught the afternoon light and scattered it in fragments. The rock face on either side was black and wet and shining. The pool at the base was deep enough to have no visible bottom, its surface perpetually disturbed by the impact above, ringed by flat stones worn smooth by 1,000 years of the same motion. The sound was total. Not loud in the way a crowd is loud, but comprehensive, occupying every available frequency, leaving no room for anything else. Walter Greer had been right about one thing. It was something to look at. Eliza stood at the edge of the pool for longer than she would later be able to account for. Not frozen, simply recalibrating. She had constructed during 2 days of walking a mental image of what she was going to find, and what she had found was substantially larger and more indifferent than that image. The land was not waiting for her. The land was not hostile to her either. The land was simply continuing the process it had been engaged in since before human categories applied, and her presence at the edge of its most dramatic feature was from the land's perspective a detail of no particular consequence. This was she realized exactly what she needed. She walked the perimeter of the pool reading the rock. The basalt face behind the falling water was not uniform. It folded and recessed at irregular intervals, the geology of it expressing centuries of differential cooling and erosion. She was looking for the thing she'd allowed herself to imagine only in the most provisional terms, the thing she hadn't told Walter Greer because saying it would have made it an expectation that could be failed. On the far side of the pool where the rock curved backward and the angle of the falling water created a kind of alcove before the main curtain, she saw it. A shadow that was the wrong shape. Not a crack, not a trick of the mist. A genuine recession in the basalt face set back far enough that the main cascade missed it entirely accessible by a narrow ledge of flat stones that ran along the pool's edge like a path someone had intended. She picked her way across those stones. They were slick, and she moved with the deliberation of someone who cannot afford to go into the water, and pressed herself against the rock face where the spray was thickest, feeling it soak through her coat in the space of 3 seconds. Then she ducked under the edge of the curtain where it thinned near the wall. The silence arrived like a physical event, not quiet silence. The falls continued 3 feet behind her, visible through the water curtain as a shifting gray-white blur, but their sound had been cut with the completeness of a door swung shut on a storm. What remained was something older, a compression of air that had been still for longer than Eliza could accurately imagine, absorbing sound and giving nothing back, shaped by centuries of rock into something that was not emptiness, but its opposite, a fullness of absence so complete it had weight. She struck her flint. The small flame trembled once in air she hadn't disturbed yet, then stabilized. The chamber opened around her in increments as she moved the light. The ceiling arched to nearly 12 feet at its highest point, basalt smoothed by moisture into something approaching polish. The floor was stone flat enough to stand on without adjustment, with accumulations of fine sand in the sheltered corners where no water reached directly. The walls were black and faintly luminous, with a microscopic film of moisture that reflected the flame back from every surface, so that she stood at the center of a dark mirror that repeated her light in all directions. It did not smell of rot or animal. It smelled of cold stone and clean water, and the particular absence of history that belongs only to places where nothing has decayed. She went deeper. The chamber continued to the right in a low passage that required her to duck her head, then opened again into a secondary space where the ceiling rose and the air changed drier, quieter, the humidity of the falls perceptible, only as a distant relative of what it was in the outer chamber. The floor here was compacted earth mixed with fine gravel, firm and level, the kind of substrate that would hold a nail if she needed it to. The temperature had a character that took her a moment to identify because she had never encountered it in exactly this form. It was cold, but uniformly cold, the same at the floor as at the ceiling, the same at the entrance as at the back wall. It was the cold of a system in equilibrium, maintained not by any mechanism that could fail, but by the sheer mass of mountain above it, regulating everything below with a patience that made human planning look impulsive. Then she found the water. A horizontal seam in the basalt at knee height on the inner wall, where a thread of water no wider than 2 fingers ran across the rock face and fell into a natural hollow. The stone had spent centuries carving for itself. She crouched, put her hand in, cold. Not ice cold, not the cold of surface water in October, but the specific coldness of water that has been underground long enough to reach thermal equilibrium with the rock around it. She tasted it. Clean. No mineral bite, no earthen heaviness. This was filtered water pressure from the mountain above, pushing it through layers of basalt that stripped everything out of it except itself. She had water inside, independent of the falls, constant. She sat on the stone floor of that inner chamber with her knees pulled up and the flame of her flint dying down because she forgot to tend it, and she stayed there for a time she did not track. Outside, the falls continued their indifferent roar. In here, the only sound was the small voice of the spring water on stone, the oldest conversation in any language. For the first time in a week, possibly longer, possibly years, though she would have had difficulty locating the precise starting point, she felt the ground beneath her as something that would hold. She had her timber source 300 yards downstream, where the creek curved through a stand of aspens before the terrain opened again. The trees were slender and straight grain, their bark white in the failing afternoon light, their remaining leaves shaking in the slight air movement off the water with a constant nervous motion as if aware of the cold coming. She had never cut a tree. This was a fact she was aware of without embarrassment, the way a surgeon is aware of anatomy as information to be used rather than a deficiency to be apologized for. She had watched her father and uncle work timber. She retrieved the memory now with the deliberateness of someone going through a toolbox in poor light, feeling for the right shape. Weight forward, feet apart. The axe should drop into the cut rather than be pushed into it. Gravity was the majority of the work her arms, the direction and timing. The notch on the fall side first opening a wedge that told the tree where it was going to go. Then the back cut higher by the width of her thumb, leaving the hinge. The first swing missed the angle entirely. The blade glanced off wet wood, the shock traveling up the handle into her wrists, and the tree showed a surface scratch that would have been humiliating if anyone had been watching. She stepped back, looked at the tree the way she had learned to look at problems not as an obstacle, but as a system with internal logic that could be understood if she stopped trying to impose her own. The issue was her weight. She was pushing the swing with her shoulders, which created force but not accuracy. She needed to commit the whole body to the arc truss, the tool's own geometry. She widened her stance, let her hands relax on the handle, brought the axe up, and then let it fall, arms guiding rather than driving. The blade entered the wood with a sound like a declaration. She found the rhythm in the second tree. By the third, her body understood the physics at a level below conscious direction, adjusting stance and angle between strokes, with the automatic intelligence of any repeated physical act that has been done correctly enough times to become its own knowledge. When the third tree came down, a deep groan that started somewhere in the root system and traveled upward through the entire length of the trunk before the wood gave way, and the whole thing fell with an impact that sent vibration through the stone beneath her feet. She stood with the axe at her side and let the feeling arrive without naming it. Fear and something that was not quite pride. both at once, no word for the combination that she knew of. That trunk was the first material of a world she was going to build herself. Moving the timber was the second education. She could not carry a full trunk. This was physics, not failure. What she could do was move it, which required the same reorientation from force to leverage that the cutting had required. She cut branches from a downed tree, stripped them to short poles, slid them under the trunks as rollers used a longer branch as a pry bar to get the thing started. Each trunk moved in a series of short advances, a foot at a time, across terrain that was irregular enough to require a different solution every 20 yards. By the end of the first week, she had 14 trunks stacked against the basalt wall at the cave entrance, damp with mist sound. The cabin rose from those trunks with a slowness that taught her patience. The way physical work always teaches it, not as a philosophy, but as a practical requirement. She built a frame first, 3 uprights, supporting a cross beam at the cabin's spine, testing every join by putting her own weight against it before committing to the next step. The walls went up log by log, each one notched at the ends where it crossed another. The notches cut in scrap wood first until she had the angle right, then transferred to the actual timber. 12 paces long, 8 wide the back wall, using the basalt rock face as its own fourth wall, which saved her 4 logs and gave the structure a thermal mass that no amount of additional insulation could have matched. The gaps between logs she filled with a mixture of clay she found in a deposit 50 yards upstream, dried grass and water from the spring. She worked it with her hands in the October cold until it reached the consistency she needed, then packed it into every joint with her fingers, pressing into the spaces, methodically checking each section by pressing her ear against the wall after the chinking dried to feel whether the wind still moved through. It took 3 applications in some places. The smell of wet clay and cold air became the smell of progress. The chimney was the place the work became dangerous. She had found flat stones in the creek bed, pieces of granite that had been waterworked into rough approximations of the shape she needed. She mortared them with a mixture of clay and coarse creek sand that she hoped would hold at temperature, building the firebox first at floor level, then the flue column rising against the back wall, then the throat where the column narrowed and the draw was created. The draw was everything. Without it, the chimney was a hole in the wall that let smoke back into the room. The first fire demonstrated this with comprehensive authority. She had the fire built well-dry wood, good kindling, a proper structure of graduated fuel. The flame caught cleanly. For 40 seconds, everything appeared to be working. Then the smoke, finding no sufficient draft in the upper column, did what smoke always does when given insufficient instruction. It went where it pleased. It poured back through the firebox opening into the cabin with a thick, eye-burning efficiency that forced her outside in under a minute, coughing hard enough to taste the back of her throat for the rest of the evening. She sat on the flat stone at the cabin entrance in the cold and thought about the physics of it while the smoke cleared. The problem was a section of the upper flue she had built slightly too narrow, combined with a bend in the column where she had angled it to clear a protrusion in the basalt. The combination created a zone of restricted flow exactly where the column needed to accelerate. She could feel the logic of it now that she knew where to look. The solution was to open the bend by 2 inches and add an exterior extension at the chimney top, a short additional column that would create a low-pressure zone above the main stack and pull the draft upward. This required dismantling the top third of the chimney she had built, which she did the following morning with the systematic lack of sentiment that the situation required. She rebuilt it with the correction incorporated, relaid the capstone she had fitted so carefully the first time, built a smaller fire to test the draw before committing to a full one. The smoke went straight up. The heat moved into the cabin with the quality of something that had been waiting diffuse at first, then gathering, then occupying every corner with a thoroughness that made the walls feel closer in the best possible way. She sat in front of it with her hands on her knees and breathed air that was warming, and the pain in her back and shoulders and the blisters on both hands were still present and would be present for weeks more, but they had acquired a different quality. They were the weight of something constructed. That was a different kind of weight entirely. By the third week, the flour was running low. She had been eating with precision calculated portions. Nothing wasted the salt, used sparingly enough that she still had adequate supply. The beans she had stretched further than she would have thought possible with nothing but water and the careful management of heat. But the mathematics of the situation were not sentimental. 20 pounds of flour in a bag of dry beans do not expand to meet need. She was down to 5 days of flour, perhaps a week of beans, if she reduced portions further, and the rains that had started the previous morning were not diminishing. She stood at the cave entrance and looked at the band of light that came through the falls curtain during the middle hours of the day. Not direct sunlight, but real light, shifting in color as the water moved, landing on the cave floor at an oblique angle that illuminated the pale stone and the accumulations of fine sand in the corners. She had been thinking about this light for a week, about what it was sufficient for and what it wasn't, and where the line between those two things could be moved by someone willing to experiment. She reached into the bottom of her pack and found what Agnes Whitfield had put there. She had not thought much about Agnes Whitfield since Millhaven. The old woman had been standing at the edge of the road when Eliza walked out of Greer's store, a woman of 70 in a coat that had started out brown and was now the color of everything watching, with the steady attention of someone who has long since stopped distinguishing between watching and understanding. She had not spoken. She had simply reached into her coat pocket, produced a small cloth packet tied with a length of cord, and pressed it into Eliza's hand as she passed. Then she had turned back toward whatever she had been doing before, as if the gesture had been a minor administrative matter she'd been meaning to get to. The packet held seeds. Lettuce, the paper wrapping said in penciled letters barely legible. Carrot, winter onion, cold tolerant. Eliza looked at them in her palm in the light from the falls curtain. She looked at the cave floor at the sections where the light fell most directly. She looked at the inner chamber passage where the temperature held steady, regardless of what happened outside, where the humidity was high enough to support growth, but not so high that it would rot what was planted. She looked at the spring, which had been producing the same thin constant stream every hour she had been here, reliable as anything she had ever encountered. She got on her knees on the cave floor and began to move stone. She pushed the larger pieces to the sides, creating a border that would define the growing area. She went to the creek and filled her cooking pot twice, bringing back the darkest soil she could find, the deep, dense earth, from the bend where the water slowed, and deposited what it had carried rich with the accumulated material of every upstream season. She built up mounds of it inside the stone borders, pressing it firm, working it with her fingers to break up the clods, checking the moisture level by feel, the way she had watched her mother check bread dough without ever understanding exactly what the test was for. Now she understood. The soil needed to hold its shape when squeezed but released cleanly when opened. It needed to be alive, not saturated. She planted the seeds in rows she could track, spacing them by finger width, pressing each one to a depth of her thumbnail, covering them with a thin layer of the fine sand from the cave corner mixed with the dark creek soil. She watered from the spring slowly with the calabash she'd found wedged in the rocks downstream, letting the water seep rather than pour. Then she looked at what she'd done. 12 small mounds of dark earth in a cave behind a waterfall in the Sierra Nevada, planted with seeds from the pocket of an old woman who had not offered a single word of explanation. There was no guarantee any of it would grow. The light was indirect and limited. The temperature held steady, but not at the ideal range for any of these crops. The seeds were from a packet that could have been sitting in Agnes Whitfield's coat pocket since last spring for all Eliza knew. Any reasonable accounting of probabilities would have assigned this project a low chance of success. She watered the mounds again in the evening. Then she built a fire in the completed chimney, which drew cleanly and efficiently now, and ate a reduced portion of beans by the light of it, calculating forward. 5 days of flour, 8 of beans at current reduction. The seeds, if they germinated at all, would not be ready to eat for weeks. Between here and there was a gap that required something she hadn't yet solved. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the cabin with the fire reduced to coals and listened to the falls, that perpetual, absolute sound that she had first registered as oppressive, and that was already beginning to lose its foreignness at the edges, beginning to become less a thing, she noticed, and more a condition of the place, like gravity, like temperature, like the slow, steady drip of the spring in the inner chamber. She had counted 22 days since she walked off her father's porch. The cabin was standing. The chimney drew. The spring was producing. The seeds were in the ground. In the morning, she would think about the gap. But the morning was not here yet, and the fire was coals, and the falls were doing what they always did, which was everything loudly without asking anyone's permission. And she fell asleep to the sound of it, with the particular quality of exhaustion that belongs to a body that has done exactly what it was capable of doing for exactly as long as it needed to. Outside in the mounds of dark creek soil, in the oblique light and the constant temperature, and the uninterrupted humidity of a mountain spring, something was beginning or trying to the first tentative cellular event in what would eventually become food, in what would eventually become a system, in what had already, against every reasonable assessment, become a home. The laugh she had laughed at the falls on that first afternoon, she understood it now. It was not the laugh of someone who had found something funny. It was the laugh of someone who had finally found something large enough to be worth the full measure of what she had in her. She went back to the aspen grove the next morning before the light was fully established, working by the pale gray that precedes sunrise in mountain country, when shapes are visible, but color has not yet returned to anything. She had a rhythm with the axe now that did not require full consciousness, though. To maintain the body had stored the correct mechanics. Somewhere below thought, and what her mind could do while her arms worked was think about the gap. The gap was simple in structure and not simple in solution. She had raw materials, timber stone, the cave, the spring, the seeds in the ground. She had tools adequate for construction. What she did not have was protein, and protein was not a thing you could improvise from basalt and good intentions. The beans were a bridge, not a destination. Without another source, eggs, milk, meat, the winter she could see building in the high peaks would close the gap for her in a way she did not want it to. She needed animals. Animals required capital she did not have in cash. This meant she needed something else. The tree she was working went down cleanly, the hinge holding until the last possible moment, and releasing with a controlled lean exactly where she had aimed it, away from the creek, into the open ground where it would be easy to limb and cut. She stood the axe head down in the soil and thought about what she had that anyone would want. Labor. She had labor in quantity, and she had demonstrated in 3 weeks of solitary construction that her labor was not theoretical. The farms in the valley below Millhaven were heading into their autumn maintenance season, fences to repair before snow, firewood, to process drainage channels, to clear before the rains did it forcefully. These were tasks that required bodies and time, neither of which most small operations had in surplus. She did not have money to buy animals, but she might have something a rancher would exchange for them. The plan organized itself with the same economy as everything else she had solved up here. Not elegant, simply functional. She would go down to Millhaven. She would talk to Walter Greer, who knew every operation in the valley. She would propose 3 days of labor at whatever property needed it most urgently in exchange for 4 laying hens, 1 milk goat, 2 ewes, 1 ram. These were not luxury animals. These were the minimum viable set for a closed system that could sustain itself through winter. She committed the plan to the category of things already decided and went back to limbing the fallen aspen. By afternoon, she had added 3 more trunks to the stack, which gave her enough timber for the additional interior partitions she intended to build in the cave, the animal section separate from the food storage area, the food storage separate from the work area near the spring. She had been thinking about the organization of the interior, the way she thought about everything now as a set of functional requirements that dictated their own solutions once they were stated precisely enough. Cold and damp near the spring, good for fresh vegetables, bad for grain and dried meat. The deeper sections where the basalt absorbed the outside temperature changes most completely maintained a more consistent and slightly warmer range, better for the long curing of preserved meat in the storage of seeds. Between the two, a transitional zone that could serve multiple purposes depending on the season. She had been mapping this with her feet for 3 weeks, moving through the cave at different hours, noticing where the floor was warmer, where condensation formed on the walls in the morning, where it didn't. The map lived in her body now rather than on any paper. She would not have been able to draw it for someone else, but she could walk it in the dark. The rain started again in the late afternoon. The serious October rain that came down from the high granite without apology, turning the creek from a manageable companion into something more assertive. She brought all the tools inside the cabin, stacked the cut wood under the rock overhang near the cave entrance, and built the evening fire with the care she always gave it. Now, not more wood than needed, not less than enough, a fire built to last the night at a useful temperature without consuming tomorrow's supply. She had calculated her wood reserve twice. She had enough for 6 weeks at current usage. The goal was 8 weeks before she needed to cut more. She ate her beans. She checked the seed mounds with the small flame she carried for the purpose looking for any change in the soil surface that might indicate germination. There was nothing yet. It was too early. She knew it was too early, but she looked anyway. The way you check a door you've already confirmed is locked because the act of checking is itself a form of reassurance. The sound of the falls at night was different from the sound during the day, not in its volume or frequency, but in what it was surrounded by. During daylight, there were other sounds layered over and under it: wind in the aspens, the creek responding to the rain, the distant calls of birds working the lower elevation. At night, those sounds withdrew and the falls were left in context of pure silence on all sides, which gave them a quality that was almost conversational, as if they were the only thing with something to say and had no reason to stop saying it. She was beginning to understand it as information rather than noise. The fall's volume told her about the snowpack above. Its tone told her about the rock face it was striking. The mist it generated told her about wind direction and barometric pressure in ways she was only beginning to learn to read. It was a system producing data continuously, and she was slowly developing the vocabulary to receive it. She did not know yet that this would matter more than she could currently imagine. She did not know yet that she would, in a dark morning 7 weeks from this one, wake to a change in the fall's rhythm that would tell her something was wrong before she had any other evidence. She did not know that the chimney she had built and failed with and rebuilt, the one that had cost her 2 days of cold and soot, and careful analysis would send a thread of smoke above the ridgeline, that a man nearly dead from cold would follow through a blizzard and find himself at her door. She did not know any of this. What she knew was that the fire was good, the cabin was sound, the seeds were in the ground, and she had a plan for the gap. She banked the coals for morning. In the darkness of the inner chamber, the spring dripped its careful rhythm onto the stone basin, patient as only water can be patient, not because it chose patience, but because it had no concept of the alternative. Outside, the falls went on. The mountain above them held its enormous silence. The October rain fell through both. In the morning, she would begin the calculations for the journey down. The descent to Mill Haven took a day and a half, and what surprised her was not the difficulty, but the strangeness of moving through country that was becoming familiar in reverse. The terrain she had learned going up each stone placement, each section, where the grade required a different distribution of weight, now presented itself from the other side, and the knowledge transferred imperfectly, the way a word looks different, written backward even when you know exactly what it spells. She reached the valley floor in the early afternoon of the second day, when the light was still useful, and walked into Mill Haven with the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone returning to a place they left under difficult circumstances and are not certain how they will be received. The town looked at her before she looked at it. This was the sensation anyway, that she crossed some threshold of visibility when she stepped onto the main road and became the object of a collective assessment that was trying to reconcile what it remembered with what it was currently observing. She had been gone 22 days. In those 22 days, her hands had acquired a layer of callus at the base of each finger that had not been there before her shoulders had settled into a different configuration, and she walked with the slight forward lean of someone who has recently spent weeks carrying weight over uneven ground. None of this was dramatic, but it was legible to anyone who knew how to read it. She heard the phrase before she saw who said it. Two women outside the dry goods store, their voices not lowered quite enough of the Holt girl, the one who went up to Coldwater. Still alive then. Not said with cruelty, said with the flat surprise of people whose prediction had failed to materialize on schedule. She walked past without adjusting her pace. Walter Greer was at his counter when she pushed open the door, the bell above it registering her arrival with its usual indifference to context. He looked up from his ledger. Whatever he had expected to see, what he saw instead produced a pause of several seconds before he spoke. God Almighty, he set his pen down. You're still standing. There was no meanness in it. There was something closer to genuine awe which she respected more than reassurance would have been. She put her hands on the counter and laid out what she needed. 4 laying hens, 1 milk goat, 2 ewes, 1 ram. She watched his face perform the calculation, the cost of the animals, the state of her finances, which he knew precisely from the transaction 3 weeks prior. Before he could arrive at the conclusion, that would end the conversation. She told him what she was offering in exchange. 3 days of labor at whatever operation needed it most. She had built a cabin framed and chinked with a functional fireplace. She could work wood-moved stone-set fence posts, clear drainage. She was not asking him to take her word for the skills. She was asking him to identify who needed labor badly enough that her 3 days were worth 4 hens a goat, 2 ewes a ram. Walter took his glasses off and cleaned them, which she had learned was how he bought time, when he was thinking rather than when he had already thought. He replaced them, looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone revising a prior assessment. Jenkins, he said finally. His main drainage channel off the north pasture washed out in the first October rain. He's been losing ground every time it rained since. His regular hand broke a wrist in September. He paused. I'll send word this afternoon. She worked Jenkins' farm for 3 days, starting before full light each morning, doing what needed doing with the efficiency of someone who had recently learned that inefficiency was a form of expenditure she could not afford. The drainage channel required clearing 200 yards of accumulated debris, reshaping the channel walls, setting new stone at 3 points, where the water had undermined the original construction. The fence line on the eastern pasture needed 18 posts, reset the old ones, having rotted at the soil line over the previous 2 winters. She reset them, tamped the soil, stretched the wire. On the 3rd day, she split 6 cords of firewood that had been sitting in rounds since August, stacking it under the shed, in the alternating pattern that allowed air circulation without losing coverage. Ezra Jenkins was a man of 55 who had farmed the same land for 30 years and knew with the certainty of someone who has been corrected by weather and soil and livestock enough times that competence was the only currency that didn't depreciate. He watched her work without comment for the first day. On the 2nd afternoon, he brought her coffee without being asked. On the 3rd evening, when the split wood was stacked and the last light was going, he walked the drainage channel she had rebuilt and came back with the expression of someone who has no complaint. The animals came with her the following morning. The hens in a slatted wood crate she had built the evening before from scrap lumber in Jenkins' woodpile. The goat on a lead rope moving with the philosophical acceptance of a creature that has decided to investigate rather than resist. The ewes and ram required more management. They stopped at the first stream crossing with the collective stubbornness of animals that have agreed among themselves to make a point. She spoke to them in the low patient register she had begun to discover, worked better than volume words, less important than tone, the tone less important than its consistency. Eventually they crossed. When the falls came into view through the tree, the animals stopped as a group. The sound reached them before the sight did, and it registered in their bodies the way it had registered in hers that first day, not through the ears, but through the feet, through the fine machinery of instinct that has not been socialized out of creatures that still rely on it. The goat's ears went flat, then forward. The ewes pressed together. The hens in their crate went quiet in a way that was more alarming than noise would have been. Eliza crouched beside the smallest ewe, the one that had been most reluctant at the stream crossings, and rested her hand on the animal's neck without gripping. She waited until she felt the tension in the muscle begin to change, which took longer than she would have preferred. Then she stood, took a slow step toward the falls, and waited again. The ewe followed. The others followed the ewe. This was leadership by the only method that works with animals, and more people than would admit it, not by demanding movement, but by making the next step seem like the natural continuation of the one before. They came through the narrow path beside the fall's curtain, one at a time, Eliza going first, each animal following her track exactly. When the last one was through and inside the cave, something shifted in the quality of the air. The space that had been emptied of everything except her own activity, filled with the sounds of living hooves on stone, the light percussion of the hens beginning to explore the boundaries of their temporary confinement, the goat moving its nose along the wall in the systematic investigation of a creature that has decided to understand its new location before judging it. The ewes found the pallet of dry grass she had laid in the designated corner and lowered themselves onto it with the collective sigh of animals that have decided to accept the situation. The hens located a ledge 3 feet up the wall and began the serious business of evaluating it as a roosting site. The goat, after completing its survey of the walls, came to stand beside Eliza with the calm proximity of an animal that has made its decision and sees no reason to announce it. The cave was no longer a project. It was a place where things lived. 3 days later, in the hour before dawn on the 29th of December, Eliza woke to the falls. She had been hearing them every night. 4 weeks had moved through the stages of adjustment, from intrusion to presence to something she could only describe as structural part of the conditions of the place, rather than a feature of it. So when they woke her now, it was not because of volume. It was because the volume had changed, or more precisely, the character within the volume had changed. A lower register had entered the sound, something heavier and less rhythmic, a percussion at intervals that had not been there the previous night. She was outside in under a minute, wrapped in every layer she owned, and what she saw stopped her at the cave entrance. The falls had tripled. The entire face of the basalt above the ledge was running water now. Not just the central channel. The pool below was churning its surface, raised by several feet, and the narrow path of flat stones she used to enter from outside had disappeared entirely underwater, that moved with a purposefulness that made the fall she had known look preliminary. The spray rose higher than the surrounding trees. The cave entrance itself, her entrance, the path she had built her entire existence around, was gone. She went back inside. The animals were awake, aware of the change in sound, but not in distress. She checked the cave floor dry. The basalt walls, polished by centuries of mineral deposit, were doing what they had always done. The mountain was sealed against its own exterior. She went to the spring. The thread of water ran exactly as it always had, producing the same narrow stream into the same stone basin, indifferent to whatever was happening outside. She calculated. Flour 3 weeks. Beans 4 weeks at current reduction. Salt sufficient. The goat was producing a cup of milk per day, modest but real. The hens had begun laying 3 days after arrival, small eggs irregularly placed, but protein and fat, and the specific evidence that the system was beginning to reciprocate. The seed mound, she checked them every morning with the focus of someone watching for signals, had produced 4 days ago the first visible change, a crease in the soil surface above one of the lettuce plantings, so slight she had questioned whether she was seeing it or projecting it. The following morning it was unambiguous. A thread of pale green, no thicker than a pine needle, pushing up from the dark soil with the absolute commitment of something that has decided to exist. She was sealed inside with enough food for weeks, with animals and water. and fire was something growing in the dark. The world outside had simply closed the door. On the third day of the flood, the knocking came. It came through the sound of the falls as fragments, irregular low, the wrong pattern for anything natural. She had learned the falls language well enough by then to know that what she was hearing was interference, something imposed on the rhythm from outside. She took the iron fire poker from its hook, held it for 3 seconds, while she assessed the quality of the sound, then set it back. That rhythm was not threat. That rhythm was exhaustion. She opened the door against the wind, and the mist drove in immediately, and what the light of her lantern found against the outer rock wall was Reverend Thomas Marsh, who had left Millhaven 4 days ago to visit the Donovan family in the high pastures and had not been heard from since. He was 58 years old and had been outside in a Sierra Nevada blizzard for long enough that his lips had taken on the blue-gray color of creekstone. His fingers were the white of something from which circulation had retreated, and he was producing speech in the disconnected fragments that indicate a mind working too hard to maintain sequence. The Donovan family, I stayed too late. The road closed. I saw the smoke from the high rock. I followed it. I didn't know anyone was here. She got him inside. This was not a single action, but a series of them, each specific to the problem it was solving. Wet outer clothing removed. Dry wool blanket from the chest where she kept the extras. 2 flat stones that had been sitting near the fire brought out wrapped in cloth, placed against the soles of his feet, where circulation needed to be coaxed back rather than shocked back. Water from the spring heated to a temperature she tested on the inside of her wrist, mixed with the wild honey she had gathered in October from a hive in a split aspen. Into his hands, into his mouth when his hands were steadier. He recovered his color in stages the way light returns after an eclipse. Not all at once, but in gradual increments that require patience from the observer. When he was capable of sustained speech, he looked around the cave with the expression of someone who has arrived expecting one thing and found something that requires a complete revision of their mental categories. You're actually living here. Not a question, not quite a statement either, more like a fact he was testing by saying it aloud. Not surviving, living. She served him beans with a piece of the dried venison she had gotten from Jenkins as part of the labor exchange, heated together in the small iron pot, and he ate with the gratitude of a man who has been cold enough to understand that warm food is not a comfort but a repair. When the bowl was empty, he held it in both hands and looked at the fire. Walter Greer said you wouldn't last a month. He paused. I agreed with him. She took the bowl, cleaned it with the fine sand she kept by the cooking area for that purpose, and set it on the shelf. What she said next was not performed. It came from the same place as everything else she had built. Her observation assessment, the honest accounting of what was true. People confuse stubbornness with foolishness because it's more comfortable than admitting they didn't see what was there. The storm that arrived the following day was larger than the one that had sealed the cave. This one came as a system rather than an event, not a surge but a sustained pressure from the north that brought snow horizontal and reduced visibility to the length of a man's arm. The falls became something beyond their previous category, a wall of sound and force that made the cave's silence feel less like absence than like armor. Marsh recovered enough to sit upright and observe, watch through the curtain of water with the expression of someone recalibrating something fundamental about the world. On the 4th day of the second storm, Eliza heard voices. They came through the falls in pieces, words stripped of their content by the water and delivered as pure sound, the shape of distress rather than its meaning. Marsh rose from his seat near the fire. She was already putting on her outer layers, all of them moving with the speed of someone who has learned that delay in cold is a form of decision. She took the oil lantern, checked the wick, closed the globe. He moved to follow her. She stopped him with a look. You stay. 2 words, no explanation needed. He had been hypothermic 4 days ago. The cold outside would simply undo what warmth had done, and she could not carry 2 people. The lateral path, the one along the rock face away from the main curtain, which she had discovered in her second week and had spent an afternoon clearing of loose stone, precisely because she had understood without articulating it that there would be a time when the main entrance was impassable, was still navigable. Barely. The water was at its edge, but not over it. She went out into a cold that was absolute, the kind that removes the distinction between outside air and inside lung, and moved along the rock face with her hand on the basalt, counting her steps because visibility was the length of the lantern's throw. She found them 100 yards out under an overhang of granite that had provided perhaps 40% of the shelter they needed, which was 40% more than the open mountain would have given them. Margaret Crane, who taught the primary grades in Millhaven, was sitting with her back against the rock. Her 8-year-old daughter, Nora, held against her chest, both arms wrapped around the child. Nora was not shivering. The absence of shivering in a child who had been outside in this temperature for an indeterminate time was information Eliza did not want to be right about. She read it the way she had learned to read all information from the mountain without revision or delay. She got Margaret upright with one arm under her shoulder, settled Nora against her own chest with the child's face turned into the relative shelter of her coat, and began the 100 yards back without pausing to explain anything. Margaret moved. Whatever the body does, when it recognizes that someone knows what they are doing and has decided to act, it did. When they came through the lateral path and the cave door closed behind them, the warmth of the fire maintained all day at its careful, constant level, rived against their bodies with a force that was close to violence. Margaret made a sound. Nora began to shiver, which was the best thing that had happened in the last hour. Marsh had not been idle. He had built the fire up by one careful increment, had heated water, had brought the spare blanket from the chest. He stood back when they came in, correctly assessing that the best thing he could do in this moment was not be in the way of someone who was managing it. Eliza worked Nora's wet boots off, found the child's feet still responsive to pressure, wrapped them in the heated stone method that had worked for Marsh, put Margaret against the fire with both hands around the warm cup, got the beans heated. Margaret Crane sat in the firelight with color returning to her face and looked around the cave with eyes that were not assessing it for what it was. She was beyond that capacity for the moment, but simply receiving it. Walls, fire, warmth, the sounds of animals in the interior chamber, food coming, her daughter beginning to shiver back to life beside her. She looked at Eliza for a long time before she spoke. "I knew about you, what people were saying." A pause. "I said the same things they said." Nora, wrapped in the wool blanket, had found the goat which had come forward from the interior chamber with the calm curiosity of an animal that extends this courtesy to everyone equally. The child and the goat regarded each other with mutual seriousness. The storm held for 3 more days. On the 7th morning, since the falls had tripled, Eliza woke to a different quality of sound, lighter, less compressed. The lower register gone, she went to the cave entrance. The path of flat stones was visible again at its near end. The falls returned to something approaching their winter normal, the pool's surface lower. The world outside had reopened itself without ceremony. Walter Greer arrived that afternoon. He came with 2 men from Millhaven who had spent the morning breaking a path through the snow that had accumulated on the lower sections of the approach. He came, it was clear from his expression, expecting to find one of several things, none of which was what he found. He stood at the cave entrance for a moment that stretched longer than most people's moments tend to stretch. Then he came inside. She showed him everything: the cabin structure against the basalt, the chinked walls, the chimney she had rebuilt, and that drew correctly. The cave's interior, the animal corner with its dry pallet, the ewes and ram in better condition than many valley animals she had seen come through. Winter, the goat moving through its morning routine with the self-possession of a creature whose needs are being met. The seed mounds where the lettuce had produced its second set of true leaves and the carrot seedlings were now visible as distinct individuals, pale but upright, growing in the measured light from the fall's curtain at an angle that Eliza had spent 2 weeks learning to use. Walter moved through this space the way a man moves through a place that is dismantling one of his convictions at each step. At the spring, he crouched and let the water run over his fingers. In the inner chamber, he stood with his hands at his side and turned slowly, taking the temperature of the air, the quality of the silence, the evidence of organization in every corner. He came back out and sat on a flat stone and was quiet for longer than Eliza had ever heard him be quiet. I told you this was rock and water. He looked at the spring outlet where the thread ran into its stone basin. I was right about the rock. I was wrong about the water. He reached into his coat and pressed a gold coin into her palm, closing her fingers around it before she could respond. That's not charity. It's payment. Food, shelter, and the road back for 3 people who needed it. A pause with the weight of something decided before he arrived. It's a debt. She kept her hand closed around the coin. This was different from Jenkins' payment in kind, different from Agnes Whitfield's wordless gift. This was Walter Greer, who had told her exactly what her options were and meant it, acknowledging that the accounting had changed. She accepted it as what it was, a transaction between 2 people who had both been operating from their best information and one of whom had been wrong. 6 months later, in the warmth of an August morning, with the falls running clear and thin and the aspens along the creek showing the first real green of the season, Eliza looked up from the exterior work she was doing and saw a figure coming along the trail from below. The silhouette was familiar in a way that took her several seconds to resolve because she was not expecting it, and the mind is slow to identify what it has not prepared to see. May Holt walked with the pace of someone who has been moving for a long time and is close enough to the destination that stopping has become the greater risk. Her braids were longer than they had been in October. The pack on her shoulder was small. She was looking at the falls with an expression that was not quite wonder, it was more like recognition, as if she had been told about this place in enough detail that seeing it was confirmation rather than discovery. Eliza stayed where she was. At the cave entrance in the morning light she waited. May stopped 6 feet away. She had the eyes of someone who has been carrying a decision for weeks and has finally put it down. Father sent me away. She said it as a fact rather than a complaint, the first thing that needed to be said before anything else could be said. Different reason, same result. Nothing in Eliza's chest loosened or tightened. It was what it was, the logic of Harold Holt applying itself to the second daughter, as it had applied to the first with whatever variation the different circumstances required. She looked at her sister's hands, which were not the hands of someone who had been idle, and at her face, which had the particular stillness of someone who has made peace with a hard thing not by resolving it, but by outlasting it. Are you hungry? May's shoulders came down a fraction. Yes. Then come in. The first days were strange, with the strangeness of proximity between 2 people who share everything in their origins and have spent the intervening time becoming quite different people in quite different ways. May talked more. She filled silences that Eliza had learned to inhabit as useful space, and this created a friction that was not hostile but required adjustment, the way 2 tools stored in the same drawer leave marks on each other. May was also, Eliza discovered in the first week, looking at everything with a precision that did not announce itself. She asked to take over the hen care on the 3rd day, which was a task Eliza assigned without comment. On the 5th day, she asked for an explanation of the irrigation schedule for the seed mounds. On the 7th evening, she spread a piece of paper on the work surface near the spring and began to speak with the focused directness of someone who has been thinking through a problem long enough to have arrived at conclusions. The cave entrance, where the basalt formed a natural shelf above the threshold, had a geometry that would support an exterior structure. A covered workspace extending 8 feet out from the cave faced sheltered from rain, and the worst of the wind positioned to use the reflected heat from the basalt wall in a way the open exterior couldn't. May had been measuring it with her stride for 3 days. She had the angles. She had the load calculations expressed not in engineering terms, but in the practical language of someone who had spent years observing how weight distributes through structures and had internalized the principles without the vocabulary. She knew which members needed to be heavier and why. She knew where the connection points were and how to make them work without metal fasteners. Eliza looked at the proposal for a long time. There was a particular quality to the recognition of a solution you had been unable to see from your own position. Not humbling exactly, more like having a gap in your map suddenly filled by someone who was standing at a different angle. She had looked at that entrance wall for 10 months. May had looked at it for 3 days. This was not about quantity of observation. It was about the difference between inside knowledge and outside eyes and what became possible when both were present. How would you anchor the front posts, she asked, because the front posts were the load point, and she needed to understand May's answer before she could commit to the rest. May showed her. The explanation was exact. The calculation behind it was sound. We start tomorrow. They worked through the 3 hottest weeks of August, the basalt wall radiating the stored heat of summer afternoons back at them. In the evenings, the physical labor organized without discussion into a natural distribution, May measuring, calculating, directing the placement of each element, Eliza executing the cuts, setting the weight-bearing members, making the final assessments of structural soundness from the position of someone who had spent a winter learning what failed and why. There were disagreements, not about the goal but about the method. May's approach to the main crossbeam differed from Eliza's instinct, and they argued it for an entire morning across the workbench until May produced her reasoning in full, and Eliza acknowledged that the reasoning was correct and her own instinct had been operating from incomplete information. The covered workspace came together the way all the things they built came together, not through elegance, but through the accumulated precision of decisions that were each slightly better than the previous one. By the end of August, it was standing roof-tight posts set the angled reflective surface of the basalt wall, doing exactly what May had calculated it would do with the afternoon heat. The first real autumn rain came in late September, arriving the way all important things arrived in the mountains without introduction at full scale. The two of them sat under the new roof with cups of warm milk and watched Coldwater Falls begin its seasonal increase, the water thickening and gaining velocity as the drainage from the high country found its way down. The spray rose. The mist rolled across the pool. The sound expanded until it filled the valley. May looked at the falls for a while. Do you think she knew, not clarifying who she meant? The answer Eliza had been constructing since December, when Nabarsh had told her what he knew about Ruth Holt, and the land she had stood on once and walked away from the answer had the quality of something she understood but could not prove. I think she saw it. She looked at the water. I think she left us the map. The silence between them had the texture of something understood rather than merely heard. Outside, the falls increased. The mountain above them held its enormous weight without comment, as it had held it for longer than anyone had been alive to notice. The covered workspace smelled of new wood and cold stone, and the particular combination of animal warmth and wood smoke that was by this point inseparable from what this place meant. What it meant was not safety exactly. Safety implied the absence of threat, and Eliza had learned too much about Sierra Nevada winters to confuse the two. What it meant was something closer to sufficiency, the knowledge that you have built something adequate to what is coming, not because you can see what is coming, but because you have made it adequate to the range of what is possible. That range would announce itself in January, and it would be larger than she had planned for. The December snow came early and without the usual atmospheric warnings. By mid-month, the valley below was buried, and the creek had taken on the color of slate, running slower under a shelf of ice that extended from both banks toward the center. The falls themselves changed character, still running the volume too great for any freeze, but slower at the margins where ice formed in the spray zone and built outward toward the central channel day by day, giving the falls a crowned appearance that caught the rare winter light and scattered it in ways that had no summer equivalent. She had the wood calculated correctly. She had the food distributed correctly between the cave zones, the deep dry section for the cured meat, the medium temperature transitional area for the grain, the cold, humid section near the spring for the root vegetables that needed that specific combination to remain viable through winter. The animals were cycling through their winter production levels, less milk from the goat, fewer eggs from the hens, the sheep requiring more hay per day. All of it within the parameters she had planned for. What she had not planned for was the second storm. It arrived in the first week of January with the specific weight of a system that has been gathering over the high country for weeks and has arrived with more force than any single season deserves. The snow that fell was not the powder of the earlier storms. It was dense adhesive accumulating on horizontal surfaces with a weight that the earlier season storms had not required her to account for. By midnight of the first night, she could hear it. The new roof, the covered workspace. It was not a crack. It was a sustained compression, a groan from the main crossbeam that communicated in the language of stressed wood that it was approaching the boundary between load-bearing and failure. She was awake in under a second, which was how her body worked now. Not gradually, but all at once, consciousness arriving complete. May was already pulling on her boots. They went out together into a night that was so white, it generated its own visibility. The snow reflecting the thin, cloud-filtered moonlight back upward, the world reduced to gradients of pale. The roof had sagged at its center by 6 inches. The front right post, the one she had questioned during construction, had shifted in its footing as the soil compressed under the weight. If the crossbeam went, the entire structure would fold inward, and taking it down in January would mean weeks without covered workspace at a time when the cave interior was at maximum pressure. She had 2 spare posts cut and seasoned under the rock overhang since October, because she had learned in a general way to prepare for what she couldn't specifically anticipate. May went for them without being directed. Eliza cleared the snow load from the critical section by hand, throwing it sideways off the roof edge, working fast because speed was the thing that mattered now, and precision was the thing she couldn't compromise. Her gloves were soaked through in 4 minutes. She kept working. May had the first spare post positioned by the time Eliza had cleared enough snow to access the footing. They set it together, May holding the post true while Eliza drove the temporary wedge pin that would hold it in position until the footing could be packed and reset. The second post went in alongside the first as additional distribution. The crossbeam, relieved of the point load at the failed footing, stopped its compression and settled into the new geometry. They stood back. The roof held. Snow continued to fall, indifferent to what had just happened. Neither of them spoke for a moment. There was nothing to say that the standing roof wasn't already saying. They went back inside shed. The wet outer layers rebuilt the fire to its proper level. May made coffee from the small reserve she kept separate from the general supply for moments that qualified. They sat with it in the specific silence of people who understand that the near thing was near enough to change how they think about everything that follows. The storm ran for 3 more days. The roof held. In the spring, May redesigned the footing system for all 4 posts based on what the failure had revealed about soil compression. Under sustained load, and the revised design was incorporated before the following winter. Daniel Greer arrived in the first week of June carrying a leather satchel, a wool cap he kept pushing up his forehead, and the expression of someone who has heard a story enough times to be skeptical of it and curious about it in equal measure. He was 18 with the hands of someone who had spent his life in his uncle's store, competent at measurement, quick with figures, unacquainted with the specific resistance that wood and stone offer to people who have underestimated them. Walter had sent him with a letter of introduction that Eliza did not need, since Walter's description of the arrangement had been plain enough in the conversation they'd had when she came down for salt in March. She put him to work on the first morning, carrying a soil from the creek deposit to the cave mounds, which needed enrichment after a full winter of production. She gave him no explanation. He carried for half a morning in silence, then asked why more soil was needed when plants were already growing. She told him the soil loses what the plants take from it, and what it loses has to be returned from somewhere, and the creek deposit was rich with mineral material that the spring soil inside the cave couldn't generate on its own. He was quiet for one trip. On the next, he asked how much soil was needed to maintain the mound production at its current level. She told him she didn't have a precise figure. She went by the performance of the plants and added when the growth rate told her something was depleted. He nodded in the way of someone filing information rather than simply receiving it. By the third week, he had produced on a piece of paper he'd brought from his uncle's store a working estimate of the cave system's production capacity expressed in numbers. Eggs per week per season. Milk output by month with a note about the correlation to daylight hours she had described. Estimated shelf life of cured meat at the temperature range of the dry intersection. The mass of soil needed annually to maintain the mound fertility based on a calculation he had extrapolated from the planting area and her description of the enrichment cycle. She looked at the paper for a long time. The numbers were correct where she could check them against her own records, and in the places where she didn't have records, they were reasonable in the way that good estimates are reasonable, not precise, but honest about their uncertainty. What Daniel had done was convert her operational knowledge into a form that existed outside her, that could be examined and revised and passed on. If you added 2 more ewes, he said, looking at the page rather than at her, the wool production reaches a quantity that could be sold, not just used, but the feed requirement in winter increases by a figure I don't have good data on yet. He looked up. I'd need another month to get that number right. She told him to stay. May found him more useful than she expected to. She had been skeptical, a boy from a dry goods store, sent to learn something she and her sister had learned by doing it. But Daniel had a quality she recognized because she shared it. He asked questions designed to understand principles rather than procedures, which meant his questions sometimes reached places that made her think about things she had been doing correctly for reasons she hadn't fully articulated. When she explained the temperature mapping of the cave, the differential zones she had been tracking since November, he asked her to walk him through her measurement method, and in explaining it, she realized she had been making a systematic error in one section that she corrected the following day. This was the thing about having another person who thought differently. It was not always comfortable. It was always useful. He stayed through August. When he left, he carried 12 pages of notes in his satchel, a round of cured cheese wrapped in cloth that his uncle had been requesting since spring, and something harder to quantify, a comprehension of the system at a level that exceeded what he had been sent to learn. Before he reached the first bend in the trail, he turned back. My uncle wants to know if I can come back next winter. He paused. To take more notes. She considered it the length of time it took to assess whether the thing being proposed was useful. It was. That depends on why. To keep learning. He adjusted his satchel strap and to write more things down. One turn of the head, the gesture that was for Eliza Holt the full extent of a yes. He went down the trail. May came to stand beside her at the cave entrance, both of them watching the aspens along the creek bend catch the late August light in their particular gold-green way, the leaves already beginning the preliminary motion toward autumn that would become full commitment by September. He'll be back, May said. He'll be useful when he is. The evenings settled around Coldwater Falls the way evenings settle in the mountains. When the work of the day is finished and the work of the next day has not yet begun, briefly, completely, with the quality of a pause between 2 long sentences. Inside, the spring kept its rhythm. The mounds held their growth. The animals settled into the slow breath of creatures whose needs were being met in a place they had decided without drama was theirs. The fall said everything they always said, which was everything all at once, without pause. What neither of them said, standing there in the last light, was that the mountain had not finished testing them. The winter ahead carried a problem that neither observation nor preparation had yet identified, and the spring that followed would make that distinction with a precision that left no room for revision. The winter that followed Daniel's departure was the quietest of the 3, which did not mean the easiest. Quiet in mountain country is a category of pressure rather than its absence, the kind that accumulates in snowpack above the ridgeline, in the tension of frozen ground, waiting for the temperature that will release it in the particular stillness of two people sharing a small space through months when the external world has contracted to the distance between the fire and the door. Eliza worked through it with the method she had developed in the first winter and refined in the second: the daily accounting of resources, the maintenance of the systems that required maintenance, the attention to small changes before they became large ones. May kept her notebooks. The cave held its temperature. The animals moved through their winter rhythms. What changed was the quality of the silence between the two sisters. Not its presence; they had always been comfortable with silence, in the way people are comfortable with it when they grew up in the same house and learned early that not everything requires narration. What changed was its texture. The silence of the first autumn May arrived had been the silence of two strangers who happened to share a history. This was different. This was the silence of people who had stood on a roof in a January blizzard together, driving posts into frozen soil by lamplight, and had come back inside without needing to discuss what it had meant. Edmund Shaw arrived in March when the snowpack was still deep on the north-facing slopes, but the south-facing granite had begun to show its dark surface in irregular patches, the mountain shedding winter in its own sequence. Walter Greer brought him, which meant Walter had been in correspondence with someone Eliza hadn't known about, arranging something she hadn't been consulted on for reasons she would need to evaluate once she understood what they were. Shaw was 65, with the deliberate economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades working in conditions where wasted motion had real costs. He had built irrigation systems across the Western Territories for 30 years, not the small-scale ditch work of individual farms, but the large infrastructure projects that determined whether entire regions could support settlement. He had the hands of someone who still worked not administratively but physically, and the eyes of someone who had spent a professional lifetime reading landscapes for what they could do rather than what they appeared to be. He did not speak for the first 3 hours. He moved through the cave with Walter a step behind him, moving his hands along the walls, crouching at the spring outlet, standing in the inner chamber with his eyes on the ceiling rather than the floor, which told Eliza he was thinking about the geology above rather than the space below. He spent a long time at the drainage channel she had carved along the cave's eastern wall, a shallow groove in the stone that redirected the moisture that seeped from the basalt during temperature fluctuations, carrying it away from the mound area toward a collection point near the entrance. She had built it in the second month, solving a problem she had identified when one of the mounds showed signs of waterlogging at its base. At the mounds themselves, Shaw crouched for several minutes, examining the soil, testing its moisture with his thumb, looking at the angle of the light that came through the water curtain at the midday hour when it was most direct. He touched the leaves of the lettuce, larger now, darker, with the robust texture of plants in their second generation of adapted growth without disturbing the root zone. He came back to the exterior workspace where Eliza was waiting and sat on the bench May had built along the inner wall. He looked at the falls for a time. The passive drainage system you built along the east wall. He stopped there as if deciding how to complete the sentence. That principle, using the natural angle of the substrate to redirect moisture without mechanical intervention, is documented in the technical manuals used by builders of storage facilities in the previous century, the ones used for long-term preservation of perishables before refrigeration was available. He looked at his hands. You rederived it from first principles, working from the problem rather than the literature in your second month of occupation. Another pause. That is not a small thing. She received this the way she received all technical observations, as information, not praise. I didn't plan it. I was solving water in the wrong place. Yes, he looked at her directly. That's how almost everything that actually works gets discovered. He stayed for 2 days examining, asking questions in the precise manner of someone who wants specific answers and knows how to ask for them. On the second afternoon, after he had walked the creek upstream for half a mile, assessing the watershed above the falls, he returned and said the thing he had come to say. The northern tributary, smaller creek that joined Coldwater Creek 200 yards above the falls, had a drainage pattern he had been observing from the ridge. In a year of heavy snowpack, when the melt came faster than the soil could absorb it, that tributary had the hydraulic capacity to shift its lower channel. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but by enough to redirect a portion of its flow toward the cave side of the basalt face rather than away from it. If that happened, the zone where the seed mounds were planted, the area Eliza had selected for its relative dryness within the cave, would be subject to a subsurface moisture increase that would change the growing conditions fundamentally. Within 2 to 3 years of such a shift, the mound area as currently configured would be compromised. He said all of this with the flat precision of an engineer communicating a structural finding without drama, because drama was not a useful component of the information. Eliza looked at the tributary channel from the cave entrance for a long moment. She had walked past that junction hundreds of times. She had registered it as part of the landscape without reading it as a variable. This was the gap between knowledge built from one position over a short time and knowledge built from multiple positions over decades. What's the solution? He described it in general terms: a small check structure at the tributary's lower bend, using the existing rock formation as one wall built to redirect the channel's energy toward the main creek rather than allowing it to spread at the base. The technical specifics would require his calculations. He would send them. He left a textbook on hydraulic engineering with certain pages marked. That night, after May had gone to sleep, Eliza read by the oil lamp until the lamp ran low, moving through the marked sections with the focused attention of someone who is not studying for its own sake, but because specific knowledge is the only thing standing between her and a problem she has just been told is coming. The recognition that arrived over those reading hours was complex and not entirely comfortable. The systems she had built were correct. The principles she had re-derived from necessity were sound. The textbook confirmed this at every point where she could cross-reference her practice against its theory. But the book also illuminated the dimensions of what she hadn't known. The failure modes she hadn't anticipated, the variables she hadn't thought to measure the ways in which systems that appear stable are in fact operating within margins whose existence requires external observation to detect. She was good at this. She was not finished becoming good at it. These two facts existed simultaneously and required no resolution. The spring that followed Shaw's visit came 3 weeks early. In mountain hydrology, early springs are not simply the same event moved forward in time. They are a different event. The snow melt that would normally be distributed across 6 weeks compressed into 4. The volume per day increased proportionally, the soil receiving more water than its absorption rate could accommodate, because the window between frozen ground and full thaw had been shortened. Eliza understood this in general terms from her 3 winters of observation. Understanding something in general terms and encountering its specific application are related experiences that do not fully prepare you for each other. The tributaries Shaw had identified began changing in the 3rd week of April. She saw it first as a difference in the sound from the main creek, a slight increase in turbidity, the water carrying more suspended material than it had the previous day, which indicated upstream disturbance. She went to look. The tributary's lower section had widened by 2 feet on its eastern bank, where the soil had been saturated long enough to lose its structural integrity. The water was not flooding, it was migrating, the channel redefining itself incrementally with each hour of continued flow, moving in exactly the direction Shaw had described. She called May out to look. They stood at the bank together, reading what they were seeing against what Shaw had told them to expect. The alignment was precise. The check structure he had described, which they had discussed multiple times since his visit, which May had sketched in 3 different configurations in her notebook, was not built yet. They had planned it for May, when the ground would be workable. May was 3 weeks away. The gap between the plan and the event was a gap they would have to work in. They built a temporary barriers that afternoon using the largest stones they could move without machinery, a rough berm along the eroding bank packed with the clay soil from the deposit upstream that Eliza had used for chimney mortar in the first year. Daniel, who had returned in March for his second learning season and was still at the cave, worked beside them without being asked. Understanding from the quality of their movement that the situation required action before explanation. They worked until the light failed, then worked by lantern for another 2 hours until the berm was at a height that would redirect the immediate flow. It held through the night. In the morning, the erosion had stopped at the berm's upslope edge. The mounds were undamaged. The subsurface moisture in the mound zone had increased measurably. May checked it with the probe method she had developed, a thin rod marked at intervals that she drove into the soil to assess moisture at depth, but had not reached the level that would damage root systems. They had been fast enough. Barely. The eastern wall of the mound section needed to be rebuilt 6 inches higher to accommodate the new moisture gradient. They did this over the following week, adding a drainage lip that would carry excess moisture toward the collection channel Eliza had built in the second month. The mounds, when the work was done, were more resilient than they had been before the event. The near failure had produced an improvement. This was not lost on her. The close thing had been close. It had also been the occasion for a redesign she would not have undertaken otherwise because she would not have known it was necessary. The mountain had forced it. Shaw's calculations arrived in May, carried up by Daniel's uncle, who came with a package of salt and a note from Walter asking Eliza with his characteristic directness whether she had given any thought to the proposal he had heard Shaw had made regarding the cave's potential role in regional documentation. The note was careful and respectful and entirely transparent about its purpose, which was to advance a conversation she had not agreed to have yet. She read Shaw's calculations. They were detailed, precise, and correct in every aspect she could verify against what she had observed. The check structure he specified would require 3 days of work, a specific configuration of stone placement at the tributary bend, and a diversion wing of compacted earth extending 8 feet upstream. It was buildable. May had already drawn the modified version that accounted for the rock formation on the site's north side. They built it over 4 days in late May, Shaw's instructions in Daniel's hand beside them. May directing the stone placement, while Eliza set the anchor courses that would carry the lateral load. On the 4th day, when the final stone was placed and the compacted earth wing was tamped firm, they redirected a portion of the tributary flow through the structure and watched what happened. The water curved. It followed the line of the diversion wing, moved around the check structure, rejoined the main creek at the point Shaw had calculated. The eastern bank of the tributary, where the erosion had been migrating in April, received a fraction of its previous flow. The soil began, in the way soil begins things slowly without announcement, to stabilize. The mounds were safe, not temporarily, permanently barring some geological event on a scale that would make the mounds the least of their concerns. Agnes Whitfield arrived in September of the 3rd year, which was later than Eliza had expected and earlier than she had given up expecting. The old woman came alone on a morning when the falls were running at their autumn volume, and the aspens along the creek had turned the specific yellow of late September in the Sierra Nevada, a yellow so saturated it looked like a decision rather than a process. She wore the same coat now, even further removed from its original color, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who has made peace with the pace that her body requires. She walked the cave in silence as Shaw had, but with a different quality of attention, less analytical, more confirmatory, as if she were checking things off against an internal list she had been keeping for some time. At the mound, she crouched with difficulty and put her fingers in the soil, and the expression that crossed her face was not surprise. She came to the exterior workspace and sat on the bench. She looked at the falls for a while. When she spoke, she said it without preamble, in the direct way of someone who has been holding a thing long enough that releasing it is simply a matter of opening the hand. Your mother came to me 2 weeks before she died. She looked at her own hands in her lap. She asked what seeds would grow in low light and stable temperature in high humidity. She had a specific place in mind. A pause. I gave her a packet. She never used it. Eliza stood very still. I kept it after she passed. I wasn't sure why. Then you came out of Walter's store that morning with everything you owned on your back, and I understood why I had kept it. Agnes looked up. It wasn't mine to explain. It was yours to find out. The packet of seeds that Ruth Holt had requested that Agnes Whitfield had kept for 3 years, that had traveled from one woman's hands to another's, without a single word of explanation, those seeds were in the soil of the mounds. They had been there since the first October. They had produced their pale seedlings, their successive generations, their current robust growth. They were the material foundation of everything. The knowledge of this arrived in Eliza's body before it arrived in her mind, the way the falls had arrived in her bones before her ears could process them. She sat down on the bench beside Agnes Whitfield. She didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the cave wasn't already saying, with its temperature and its water and its growing things and its animals and its two women who had built it from what a dying woman had seen and not been able to reach. Agnes stayed for the afternoon. She taught May 3 preservation techniques, a fermentation method using ceramic vessels sealed with rendered tallow, a way of layering root vegetables with dry sand that extended their viability by weeks, a method for assessing whether stored grain had begun to develop moisture damage before it became visible on the surface. She delivered each piece of knowledge with the economy of someone who has been teaching things informally for 40 years and has refined the transmission to its essential elements. She left before the light failed, declining the offer to stay the night with the brevity of someone who prefers their own bed and sees no reason to apologize for it. She did not say whether she would come back. She would come back 3 more times before the following winter, each time with something specific to contribute and nothing extraneous to say. The letter from the Department of the Interior arrived in the second week of September, one day after Agnes's visit, carried by the same postal rider who brought Walter's monthly supplies. The envelope was official in the way government correspondence is official, precise in its formatting, restrained in its language, communicating significance through understatement. It was addressed to the owner of the Coldwater Falls parcel. The letter explained in the measured prose of institutional communication that the department had received technical documentation from a consulting engineer describing a system of cold storage, food preservation, subterranean cultivation, and passive thermal management in operation at a private Sierra Nevada property. The department's division of Western Settlement was engaged in compiling practical guidance for communities in the high-altitude territories of California and Nevada, where conventional agricultural methods were insufficient for year-round food security. If the proprietor of the described operation was willing, the department would welcome either a written description of the methods in use or a direct meeting with a regional representative at a location of her choosing. Eliza read it twice. She gave it to May, who read it once, then set it on the work surface with the careful placement of someone who needs a moment before she responds to a thing. Do you want to? May's voice was even carrying the question without the weight of an opinion she hadn't been asked for. The falls moved in front of them, their September volume the moderate, almost conversational level that was the easiest to think alongside. Eliza looked at the water. She thought about what was in Denver, a city she had never seen. People she had never met, a conversation conducted in the language of institutions rather than the language of tools. And she thought about what was here. The two categories were not in opposition. They were simply different scales of the same problem, which was how you make a place sustain life when the conditions are difficult. I don't know what they know that we don't. She was still looking at the water. But I don't know what we know that they don't either. The only way to find out is to go. May picked up the letter. Then we go together. The letter May wrote to Harold Holt appeared on the work surface one morning in October, 2 weeks before they were set to leave for Denver. It was sealed, addressed in the handwriting Eliza had known since May was 7 years old, firm letters with a slight forward lean, as if the words were trying to move faster than the hand that formed them. She did not ask what it contained. She looked at it for the time it took to understand what it was and what it meant, then asked May if she wanted it sent with the next Walter delivery. May looked at the envelope with the expression of someone who has completed something that needed completing, regardless of whether it would be acknowledged. Yes, she turned back to the fermentation vessel she was checking. I don't expect an answer, but he should know. There was no rancor in the words. No performance of forgiveness, which is always its own kind of demand. It was the statement of someone who had decided that the account required closing on her side regardless of whether the other party participated. Eliza put the letter with the outgoing items and returned to what she had been doing. The conference in Denver occupied 2 days in November in a meeting hall that smelled of coal heat and the specific mixture of wool coats and earnest effort that fills rooms where people have come to solve problems they take seriously. There were 11 other people present from territories across the West, each of them working on some version of the question Eliza had been working on for 3 years. How do you sustain human life in conditions that were not designed for it, using resources that require you to understand them before you can use them? The man from Montana preserved winter meat and ice he harvested from frozen lakes and stored in insulated earth cellars, maintaining temperatures below preservation threshold through the summer by the physics of thermal mass. The woman from eastern Nevada had developed a crop rotation system that allowed her soil to recover nitrogen between seasons, extending the productive life of ground that would otherwise be exhausted in 3 years. A young engineer from Colorado was studying the hydraulics of gravity-fed water distribution, moving water from elevation to point of use without pumps or mechanical systems, the energy of the water's descent doing the work of delivery. Each of them had solved a specific version of a general problem. Each solution was complete in itself. Each was also incomplete without the others, because the full problem, how people live in difficult country over the long term, was larger than any single person's position within it allowed them to see. Eliza spoke less than anyone in the room. She listened with the quality of attention she had developed in 3 years of learning from situations that did not repeat their lessons if you missed them the first time. What she was doing as each person described their methods was mapping the relationships where this person's solution would improve her system, where her system answered a question they were still trying to solve, where the combination of several approaches produced something none of them had separately. May asked questions. They were direct, specific, aimed at the mechanism behind the method rather than the method itself, the same quality she had shown in her first week at Coldwater Falls when she had asked about the irrigation schedule with the precision of someone who wanted to understand principles rather than procedures. By the second afternoon, she had exchanged written contact information with 3 people because she had identified the specific exchanges of knowledge that would produce value for both parties. At the close of the second day, a government representative approached them, a man of 40 in a suit that was government issue in its practicality, carrying a notebook that was government issue in its organization. He wanted to know, with the careful phrasing of someone proposing something he is not certain will be accepted, whether the proprietors of the Coldwater Falls operation would consider allowing it to be designated as a reference site for the department's settler guidance program. Groups of new arrivals to the high-altitude territories could visit, observe the methods in operation, receive instruction in the foundational principles. Eliza let him finish. Then she stated her conditions in the same order she had decided them on the ride to Denver without negotiation or softening. No group larger than 8 visitors. No visits between October and April when the system was under winter pressure. Complete authority retained by the site's operators over what was shown and how it was described. No commercial arrangement involving the land without explicit written agreement. She was not asking. She was describing the terms under which she would agree. He wrote each condition in his notebook, without disputing any of them, which was the response of someone who recognizes that the thing being offered is more valuable than the conditions attached to it. Daniel, who had come to Denver as their assistant, keeping notes, managing the practical logistics of the journey, drafted the formal agreement that evening in the hotel room they shared as a group of 3. He wrote it in the direct, unambiguous language he had developed through months of converting observed practice into documented knowledge, each clause specific enough to preclude the interpretations they didn't want. Walter Greer received a copy by post 2 weeks after they returned. His reply came back within 10 days, a single page in his precise commercial hand, confirming his support for the arrangement and enclosing without comment a tin of oat cookies that traveled the mountain road in better condition than might have been expected. December arrived with the three of them at the cave, Eliza May Daniel in his second extended stay. The snow came correctly this year, the way the first winter's snow had come in the proper sequence of small storms building to larger ones, the temperature dropping in gradual stages that allowed the ground to freeze uniformly before the deep cold settled. The animals moved into their winter patterns. The mounds continued producing at the reduced winter rate that was still, after 3 years of soil development, substantially better than what the first winter's mounds had managed. The technical report took 3 weeks to compose. They wrote it together at the exterior workspace under the covered roof that May had designed on days when the weather allowed and inside the cave on the days when it didn't. Eliza provided the operational detail, the methods, the sequences, the things she had learned by doing them incorrectly first and correctly afterward. May contributed the measured data she had been recording since her arrival, temperature ranges, by cave zone moisture levels, by season production figures, by animal and plant variety, the systematic record of a person who had understood from the beginning that knowledge without documentation is knowledge that exists in only one mind. Daniel organized, structured, asked the clarifying questions that turned description into instruction, rewrote sections where the logic was clear to the authors and would not be clear to someone encountering the information without context. The finished document was 12 pages. It was not elegant. It was precise, which was the thing it needed to be, the kind of writing that could be handed to a person in a different mountain range, facing a different specific version of the same general problem, and give them something they could actually use. They sent it without knowing if anyone would read it. This was not resignation, it was accuracy. The document's usefulness existed independent of whether it was used the way the cave's temperature existed, independent of whether anyone was inside measuring it. They had made it as well as they could make it. That was the part that belonged to them. Margaret Crane came in early spring of the 4th year with 10 children from her school's upper class on a morning that was cold enough to see breath, but clear enough to make the falls visible from the trail below as a white stroke against the dark granite face. Nora was among them, 4 years older now than she had been in the blizzard, with the settled quality of a child who has been through something real and knows it, moving through the group with a quiet authority she had not needed to be given. Eliza brought them through the lateral path one at a time, instructing each child to stop just inside the entrance and stand still for 1 minute before moving further. No explanation. Several of them looked at her with expressions that asked whether this was a rule or a request. She looked back until they understood it was neither. It was a practice, and the practice was the point. In the silence they had been asked to hold, the cave spoke in the only language it had. The springs drip, the animals shifting in the interior, the distant presence of the falls as a vibration rather than a sound. From this angle, the temperature arriving on their skin as something stable in a world of variables. By the end of the minute, they were all still. She showed them the system with the vocabulary she used for adults, because children who are treated as capable of understanding things generally are. The temperature differential between zones, the springs' independence from the falls, the mounds and why they were positioned where they were oriented to catch the specific angle of light that reached the cave floor at midday in the winter months. The animal section and the reasoning behind its separation from the food storage. One boy, dark-haired, with the intense stillness of someone who processes everything before responding to it, stopped at the mounds and looked at them for longer than the others. How do the plants know it's not nighttime if it's always the same in here? She looked at him with the attention his question deserved. They don't know. We create enough of the conditions they need so they don't have to know. The light, the moisture, the temperature, we manage all of it on their behalf. She paused because the second part of the answer was the more important one. That's what it means to build a system. You make it possible for the things inside it to thrive without requiring them to understand what you've done. He thought about this for long enough that the group had moved on. Then he nodded once with the gravity of someone confirming a calculation. Margaret wrote something in her notebook. By the time the fourth year's spring had settled into summer, Coldwater Falls had received three groups of visitors under the new agreement with the department, one in May, one in June, one in late July. Each group came with specific questions generated by specific problems in their specific territories. Each left with something they had not had when they arrived, which was the only measure of whether the visit had been worth making. After the July group departed, Eliza stood at the cave entrance in the late afternoon light. The falls were in their summer configuration, thinner, more translucent. The curtain light enough that the afternoon sun came through it at the right angle, in a way that sent broken color across the basalt face, brief, fractured light moving with the water's motion. She thought about May's hand flat against the cold window glass that October morning 4 years ago, that felt simultaneously recent in its clarity and geologically distant in what had occurred since. She thought about Ruth Holt standing at this same place with the knowledge of what the cave held and turning back toward the trail. She thought about a packet of seeds passing between two women's hands and waiting 3 years to become what it was supposed to become. The account of those years was not a simple one. There had been no point at which the outcome was certain, not in the first winter when the beans were running low, not in the blizzard that sealed the cave, not when the tributary began migrating toward the mound section with the patient indifference of water that has no preference for your plans. The system had not survived because it was inevitable. It had survived because every point at which it could have failed had been met by someone paying close enough attention to act before the failure was complete. That was not the same as security. It was better than security. It was competence which could be taken to the next problem. She thought about this boy at the mounds, his question about nighttime and plants, his long pause before the nod. She thought about what Margaret was going to do with what she had written in that notebook. She thought about Daniel's 12 pages of notes and the 12 pages of technical documentation, and where both sets of pages were going into whose hands toward what uses she would never be able to observe. The fall shifted color as the sun dropped behind the ridge. The fractured light on the basalt face dimmed to something cooler. May was inside at the fermentation vessels doing the evening check she did every day at this hour without discussion, because it was the hour when the check needed to be done. Eliza picked up the axe from the hook where it lived between uses. She tested its weight in her palm, the balance of a tool that had been used correctly enough times that it felt like an extension of intention, rather than an object. She had sharpened it 2 days ago on the flat creek stone she kept for that purpose, the edge keen in the way that becomes automatic when maintenance is simply part of what you do. She walked toward the aspen stand. There was wood to cut for the evening fire, which was needed, which was sufficient reason. The work would not end. It had never been going to end. This had once seemed like a limitation and now presented itself as the thing that made everything else possible. The constancy of necessary work, the way it anchored each day to something real, the way it made the future not a destination but a continuation. She had found here at the edge of a waterfall that had no interest in her survival or her failure, something she had no inherited language for. It was not happiness exactly, though happiness was present. It was not safety which remained as it had always been provisional. It was the specific satisfaction of a life built from its own materials, accountable to its own logic, sustained by the quality of attention you brought to it each day. It required nothing from anyone else's recognition. It had been real before anyone recognized it, which was the only kind of real that couldn't be taken back. The first stroke of the axe entered the wood with the sound she had learned to make in the first week and had not had to think about since. The aspens held their gold in the failing light. The falls kept their counsel. In the cave, her sister moved through the evening work. Above them, the mountain held its long patience, the kind that had no opinion about what was built beneath it, only the silent fact of its own continuance, which was she had come to understand exactly the kind of ground you could build on.